At this time, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jim McGlone. Jim has a PhD in human ecology from Virginia Tech and a master's certificate in environmental law and policy from the USDA Graduate School. He has taught economics at Virginia Tech, Ohio State, and Northern Illinois University, and has done research at the Economic Research Service of USDA. A self-taught naturalist and ecologist, he has managed the natural resources of a 500-acre park in Fairfax County and is currently an urban forest conservationist with the Virginia Department of Forestry in Northern Virginia. He is an ISA certified arborist and has the ISA tree risk assessment qualification. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. So good afternoon and welcome to this, come on. There we go. Welcome to our course this afternoon on landscape, woody plant adaptations, a view from the forest. As it was said, my name is Jim McGlone. I work for the Virginia Department of Forestry. I've been working in Fairfax County now for almost 15 years. And as such, I am both an arborist and a forester. And so I look at trees from those two different perspectives. And although arborists and foresters both work with trees, they look at them in different ways. And I have found over the course of my career with the department that the two different viewpoints tend to inform each other. And so being a trained arborist makes me a better forester. Being a trained forester, I think, makes me a better arborist. And today we are going to be looking at trees that people, when landscape woody plants particularly, I'm going to be talking about trees that people might want to plant in their yards. And I'm going to give you my perspective on that as a forester. So to begin with, what we need to realize and recognize is there are no trees that are specifically adapted to this space. It has not been part of our landscape. It's not been something trees have had to deal with for long enough to have an evolutionary adaptation. So what we need to do is look at how trees adapt and how they are dispersed across the landscape to figure out what the constraints are and what trees might do well in this kind of a landscape. This picture, by the way, is my next door neighbors. I don't have any grass in my yard, so my trees are doing well. One of the misconceptions that even I had, and a lot of people have, is the idea that trees grow where they find resources that they need. And that is exactly wrong. Trees grow where they can deal with missing resources. So as gardeners, you all know that plants need sunlight, they need carbon dioxide, they need water, they need nutrients in the form of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, sulfur, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But not all places in the landscape have the same availability of those. So trees will distribute themselves where they can deal with the stresses of the missing or the reduced amount of those resources. This is bald cypress. I took this picture down in Florida. Bald cypresses are famous for growing in water, and people think that they need lots of water, which is why they grow there. But if you think about the soils in the bottom of that lake where these cypresses are growing, they are permanently saturated, which means they have very low oxygen. And cypress trees are very, very good at growing in low oxygen soils. And as it turns out, they make really great yard trees. My only disappointment is that when you plant them in your yard, they don't develop knees, because I think that'd be really cool to have a tree with knees in it in the front yard. So with that in mind, let's take a walk down a hill. As you can see, I am a very gifted and talented graphic artist. This is a hillside somewhere in Virginia. The gray portion here is the bedrock, and the brown is the soil. And as master gardeners, you know that soil consists of sand, silt, and clay. And sand and silt are basically just really small rocks that come from the bedrock. The clay, on the other hand, is made in the topsoil as a result of chemical weathering of the sand and silt that reorganizes the crystalline structure of the atoms and the elements available from the bedrock or the parent material. And as such, the clay, which you should have learned is very important for maintaining fertility and moisture in the soil. Because the particles are so small, they will migrate with water molecules through the soil column. And so what we see is topsoil is continually making clay, which is leaching down into the subsoil. But that same process, gravity on a hillside, is also pulling clay from the top of the ridge down towards the bottom, not only through that leaching process, but also as the soil tends to slough down towards the bottom of the hill. In addition, gravity is pulling organic material that may fall on the top of the soil and later be incorporated as going downhill. The result of that is at the top of the hill, we tend to have thin, dry, and fertile soils. Whereas at the bottom of the hill, where we have thicker soils that are accumulating the organic material and the clay, so they're richer soils, but they also stay saturated for longer periods of time, so they tend to be more anoxic. And then the middle of the slope is the deep, rich, moist, well-drained soil that pretty much every plant likes to grow in. So even though we have some trees that grow at the top of the hill and some that grow at the bottom of the hill, they really all want to grow in the middle of the hill. This is something that foresters have recognized for a long time. This is a very old diagram that you find in forestry, which shows site growth response. So along the horizontal axis here, we have site quality. So over here to the left, these are your thin, dry, or infertile soils, not great growing conditions for trees. As we move to the right, growing conditions improve. Along the vertical axis, we have something that foresters call site index, which is how tall you expect trees of a given species to be growing on this after 50 years of growing on this site. And so for most of these trees that are listed here, these constitute what we call the dryland oaks, and the shortleaf pine and loblolly pine have a fairly shallow growth response. So as they move on to, or they colonize better soils, they will grow a little better and a little faster, but not much. Yellow poplar, on the other hand, has a different strategy. Instead of adapting to stressors the way the oaks do, and in this case, these species are all well adapted to dry and fertile sites that you typically find up near ridge lines. Yellow poplar, on the other hand, has a very good growth response to improve site quality. And so what its strategy is to go to the middle of the slope where you have those deep, rich, moist, well-drained soils and grow really fast and outgrow all the rest of the trees that might grow, outcompete all the rest of the trees that might grow there and dominate those sites. So as we walk downhill, we're going to go from fairly infertile or dry sites through really good sites and then into anoxic sites. And we get different trees growing at different places on the hillside. The other thing that foresters recognize is what we call aspect, and that's the directions that a slope is facing. Because north-facing slopes are always in the shade in Virginia, they tend to be wetter than the south-facing slope on the other side of the hill. And similarly with east-facing and west-facing slopes, the east-facing slope which gets the same amount of sun as the west-facing slope, but gets it early in the morning, tends to be wetter because it takes more solar energy to evaporate soil moisture from the east-facing slope than from the west-facing slope in the late afternoon when it's hotter. So all of these things dictate somewhat where trees grow in the landscape. And so when we look at these dry, infertile sites, so this would be ridge lines or tops of hills, but it would also be sandy coastal soils. These are the dryland oaks, the chestnut, post, scarlet, white, black, southern red, northern red, are all well adapted to dealing with these dry sites, because dry and infertile sites, because they're very good. They're either very good at extracting water and nutrients from the soil, or they're very efficient at using them. And that it's probably the use of those resources rather than the extraction of the resources that drives their ability to deal with these sites. And that's indicated by that poor growth response to improve site quality. Down on the coast, our live and laurel oaks are also very good, particularly at extracting water from the soil. The live oak is one of the very best trees at pulling water out of the soil in North America. The other plants that you tend to find in these kinds of site are the heaths. So laurels and native azaleas and blueberries and rhododendrons and huckleberries and sourwood. And for those of you who live in the Southwest who are familiar with sourwood, you may not have recognized that it is a relative of the blueberry, but if you look at the flowers, it's pretty obvious. Most of our pines would also grow on these sites, with the exception of pond pine, for obvious reasons. And then pignut hickory is the hickory species that I see tending to associate with some of the dryland oaks, particularly with the northern and southern red oaks. By the way, that list of dryland oaks is in order of their tolerance for these sites. So the chestnut oaks are the ones that you're going to find on the really, really crappy sites. Excuse me. And then the other oaks will start to come in and the chestnut oaks will fall out, and then we will go into those mid-slope sites. One of the trees that is particularly well adapted, particularly to these coastal soils that can be really deep, especially the old sand dunes, is longleaf pine. This picture I took down at a nature preserve in Florida. This is a longleaf pine that was blown over. And to interpret it, hopefully you can see my cursor moving up and down here. This structure in the middle, the dark structure, is actually what would be the root plate of most trees. And then going off to the right, you can see the trunk of the tree. And this piece down here is the taproot of the longleaf pine. Part of the reason I wanted to put this picture in here is not only to show you their adaptability to these really deep sandy soils, but also to point out that the longleaf pine is the only tree that actually develops a true taproot as we think about it. Most other trees, as seedlings, they do have taproots, but at some point the tip of that root reaches a spot that's not very hospitable, and signals go out and it starts developing the lateral root system. So they do not continue to develop the way the longleaf pine does. Another place where you can find these dry and fertile soils and these types of forests is at Piney Grove Preserve in Waverly. It's down between south of Waverly and Wakefield. This is a property that's owned and operated by the Nature Conservancy. It was a loblolly pine plantation when they purchased it, and they are managing it for red-cockaded woodpeckers. It's the northernmost, I think it's the northernmost population of red-cockaded woodpeckers in the country. Because it was planted in loblolly, the presence of the loblolly doesn't indicate the site, but when you visit it, you will find remnant hardwoods, and the hardwoods that are growing there are white pines and southern, white pines and southern red oak, or excuse me, white oaks and southern red oaks. And we found this is a new plant that I encountered down there. It's Rhododendron atlanticum. It's called a dwarf white azalea. So spreaded throughout a lot of the green in this photo is those azaleas getting ready to bloom. So even though this isn't a ridge line, it is a dry site. And that's the point, is that you can find these dry sites there. Alternatively, if you know what kind of sites these trees tend to grow on, it will tell you something about the site. So if I get a call from a landowner that says, I've got this property I want you to come out and look at, and it's pretty much all chestnut oak, I have a really good idea of what kind of property and what the soil qualities are out there and what can be done with that property as a result of that. This is another oak heath forest. Almost all of the understory here is mountain laurel, greater rhododendron, and I'm pretty sure this one, the reason I took this picture is that there was a flame azalea in bloom there in the foreground. The overstory is almost all dryland oaks with a few hickories and some white pine. Moving further down the slope to the bottom of the slope, where we get these poorly drained hypoxic and anoxic soils, these are the species you find down there. It's also called riparian species. So bald cypress and Nyssa aquatica will both grow in standing water. Atlantic white cedar you find in bogs down in the Great Dismal Swamp in the southeast. I haven't spent a lot of time there. I'm not really familiar with this plant very well, so I don't know if it actually grows in the standing water or grows on the little hummocks within the bog. But then the rest of these trees are all typically found down along riverbanks. Juglans would be both black and white walnut, or black walnut and butternut, depending on what you call it. And if you look carefully at this list, one of the things you will recognize as gardeners is a lot of the trees that we see frequently in our landscapes, planted trees in our landscapes, are on this list. All of these trees have figured out a way to deal with the fact that they are growing in soils that are saturated for long periods of time, and there may be periods when oxygen is not available to the root system. Some of them, the adaptation is to put out roots that look more like bean sprouts than your normal tree roots, that have a lot of space in them where oxygen can be stored. Moving further down, or moving back to the middle, when we look at the mid slope and the coves, and for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of or geology of coves, a lot of them occur this way, where you have kind of a dip in the bedrock, and so soil coming down from higher up the slope accumulates there, and that's where you get those deep, rich, moist, well-drained soils. And particularly in the Appalachians, sites like this are going to be dominated by tulip poplar, to the point where we have a specific stand designation called a poplar cove. But you will also find basswood, big tooth aspen, mockernut hickory. If you are at higher elevations, you might find yellow birch or sweet birch, beech. For those of you in the southeast, Fraser magnolias and sugar maples at higher elevations. So this is the way trees are dispersing themselves across the landscape. A lot of it has to do with the soils. There are a few trees, however, that don't fall into this analysis. Red maple will grow pretty much anywhere. I have seen it growing in swampy areas on little hummocks. Its range runs from central Florida to northern Maine and all the way to the Mississippi. And it grows. And so telling me that you got red maple in your forest doesn't tell me anything at all about your forest, because it'll occur almost anywhere. Black gum is another one that you will find on a wide variety of sites along with these others. Eastern red cedar will grow, tends to dominate sites that are old pastures or old turf. Because unlike a lot of our trees, Eastern red cedar does not need contact with mineral soil in order to germinate. So it will grow even in good turf. I'm sure some of you have, when you were mowing the lawn, saw little Eastern red cedars trying to grow in your lawn. It's not a reflection of how poor your turf is. It's just that cedar can do that. The other tree that's very good at infiltrating pastures and germinating away from mineral soil is autumn olive. So if you wind up, if I'm looking at a monoculture of Eastern red cedar, I know that the land use history was good quality, either pasture or good quality hayfield, probably in fescue. Another stress that trees have to adapt to is light. So you probably, or you should all be familiar with the concept of succession, where you start with an old field and your pioneer species are the first woody plants to move in there. It's what we call them. Then they give way to the mid-successional species. And finally, if there are no disturbances, to the climax species. And as a result, different trees have different responses or needs for sunlight. So most of the pioneer species are very shade intolerant. These would be things like Eastern red cedars, most of our pines. One exception would be the Eastern white pine, tulip poplar, sweet gum, locust. These are the trees you typically see moving into and being the first colonists of an old field. Now, some of them, like tulip poplar and sweet gum, are very long-lived species and they maintain their hold there. Eastern red cedar, Virginia pine tend to be shorter-lived species, and they will not hold that site for very long. Nevertheless, over time, these low to moderate shade-tolerant trees, which we call mid-successional trees, like the oaks, the hickories, hackberries, sycamores, basswood, elms, and a few others, these are trees that can germinate, sprout, and grow for a while in the shade of a closed canopy forest, but they will eventually need direct sunlight to make it up to the canopy and become dominant trees in the forest. Some of them, like the oaks, the sycamores, basswood, and elm, grow along stream sides, so they may be benefiting from an open canopy over a larger stream where they're growing. The oaks and hickories are characterized as what we call gap regenerative species. And that means they will germinate, they will grow in the shade for sometimes 30 or 40 or 50 years. But if they don't get a gap in the canopy that they can exploit, they're never going to make it to be a dominant canopy-sized tree. And we have a few other trees that have very high shade tolerance. Beech, holly, maple, black gum, hemlock. These trees can actually regenerate and reproduce in their own shade. And for particularly beech, holly, and maple, they need a forest that is undisturbed. And typically, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that disturbance in Virginia comes in the form of a fire. These trees are very shade tolerant, but they have very little tolerance for fire, and they tend to be very thin barked and will be at least top killed. Even mature trees will be killed in what we call surface fires. This would be fire that is just burning up the leaves, the leaf litter and stuff in the forest. The one exception is the black gum, which is both one of the few trees that's both shade tolerant and fire tolerant. And again, red maple can occur in any of these. With the wing seeds, I see red maple pioneering sites. It'll grow very well in full sun, but it's also very shade tolerant. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that red maple will pop up just about anywhere. When we're talking about competition for light, I mentioned the eastern white pine is more shade tolerant than a lot of our other pines. This picture is an oak forest in southern Pennsylvania. I actually was at Hawk Mountain when I took this picture. My wife and I went there to look at raptors, and we got to the top of the cliff. She started looking up for raptors, and I looked down and I saw all these white pines standing above the canopy of these mature oak trees, and quit looking for birds because I'm a tree guy. So this is something you don't often get a chance to see, but this is the strategy for eastern white pine. They typically grow in mixed forests, although there will be some places where you will have pure stands of white pine. And their strategy for dealing with the hardwoods they grow with is to grow much taller than they will. So the canopy trees that you see here, the ones, this is during leaf off, are 80 to 100 feet tall, and these white pines are 120 to 130 feet tall. So they're taking advantage of the fact that they can grow and get much taller than these hardwood trees. The other thing that will happen when we release trees from light competition, in the forest they tend to be tall and narrow. But when they're open grown like this oak, and some of you may recognize this, I took this picture at the Stevens City Cooperative Extension Office there in Franklin County. This oak is up on the hill. It's obviously grown, been open grown throughout its life, and it's shorter and stockier. And this is an adaptation you see in most hardwoods. If you take them out of the forest, they're going to grow with a much bigger and open and lower crown than they would in the forest. One exception to that is tulip poplar, which tends to continue to be tall and limbed up and hold its crown high off the ground. And the other is eastern white pine, which continues to grow pretty much the same way it does in the forest. And because it's relying on the trees around it in the forest, it's one of the reasons it's not a terribly good landscape tree. It gets shallow roots. It's subject to wind throw. And if people prune those lower branches that won't prune off naturally, they will get breakage, because naturally what will happen is the branches will when it gets snow or ice on it, they will shift that load down the canopy until they reach either the hardwood surrounding them or they reach the ground if it's open grown. So we have to, this is a caution when you start thinking about this information I'm giving you. When you take a tree away from the forest, that may affect the way that it grows. And this I wanted to put in because one of the things people always ask me about trees is they'll point at a large diameter tree and say, how old do you think that tree is? A couple 100 years? Well, these are two white oak, we call them tree cookies, that we harvested at Conway Robinson State Forest when we were doing a thinning project there. And you can see the one on the left is much bigger in diameter than the one on the right, but the one on the left is only 7 years old. The one on the right is 34 years old. And this is what I was talking about with the oaks being able to grow in the shade or struggle in the shade for a long time, but they still need to get that sunlight. And of course, the purpose of the project was to give sunlight to some of the other trees or seedlings that were growing out there. So never be fooled by looking at a large tree and thinking it's hundreds of years old. One of the other things that trees have to adapt to, especially in an urban setting, is salt. And this is not something that a lot of trees, except for those that you find in coastal areas, have specific adaptations for. So plants like this red mangrove that's growing in salt water, and all the plants around it, they have some sort of a strategy, some sort of a process for either eliminating salt from the plant as it's taken in with the water, or excluding the salt when they take in water. And of course, the problem with salt is it causes dehydration versus via the osmotic pressure. Hopefully you learned sometime in your basic training class that water will flow from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So when we get salt in our soils, that raises the concentration in this soil water, and frequently, or can raise it above the concentration within the plant, and that will draw water out of the plant. That's the issue we have with direct deposition during de-icing, when the salt trucks or the guys who are out there managing the sidewalks or the drives or whatever are getting salt on areas that they're not trying to de-ice, getting it into the soil along the road or along the walkways. The other problem we run into is snow spray, or where we have put down salt and then we plow, and the plows throw the salt sometimes onto the plants if they're growing close to the road. Most plants, at least most evergreens, that snow spray can be a problem for. And I'm not aware of a lot that are not coastal plants that evolved with sea spray or sea winds that are well evolved to deal with that. The salting of the soil and the effects on soil moisture, though, many plants have to deal not necessarily with salt, but with other chemicals or other conditions in the soil that can cause that osmotic pressure. VCE has a very good and long handout that you should be able to download from the website. I forget what it's called now, the palette or whatever, that has a long list of salt tolerant plants that you can grow in Virginia. Many of them are coastal zone plants, but not all of them. Some of them grow in the uplands. Now, this is not something I normally would have talked about in this this kind of a setting, but when I was asked to do this, I was asked to talk about fire adaptations. And there are two ways that plants are adapted to fire. One of them is through needing fire to complete life cycle processes. This would, the most obvious one would be jack pine and giant sequoia and lodgepole pine that have serotinous cones. There are a few others. The serotinous cone is one that is glued shut with resins and needs the heat of the fire to actually open them up. And it varies, the amount of heat needed to open those cones varies between species. Jack pine and giant sequoia need the heat of a fire to open up. Lodgepole pine needs heat. Excuse me, but if the cones fall on a south or west facing slope, they can get enough solar heating that their cones will open up and disperse the seeds. But Another requirement that a lot of plants throughout the country and even here in Virginia have, I've already mentioned, the need for contact with mineral soil. So a lot of trees, the seeds won't germinate until there's a fire to remove a lot of the duff and the forest floor and the leaf litter and things that the seeds might get caught up in. Germination is another aspect of fire that affects trees. Some of them need to be heated in order to allow the embryo to break out of the seed coat and reach the environment, in much the same way that some seeds need to go through the gut of a bird or a mammal where they get scarified and or treated with acids in order to germinate. And then there is smoke chemistry. In particular, the Mylar process, which is involved in the burning of cellulose. And all of the backyard cooks who like to grill have at least experienced the Mylar process, because that's what gives you that nice brown crust on your meat when you grill it. Well, there's some chemicals that are released as a result of that process that are oil soluble, and then there are some that are water soluble. And the interesting thing is that the oil soluble chemicals will attach to seeds and encourage germination. So the fire is actually telling the seeds in the soil, we have your competition for sunlight is gone. This is a good time to germinate. The water soluble chemicals, on the other hand, will attach to the seeds and prevent germination. So taken together, the smoke is telling the seeds that are already present in the seed bank in the soil, this is a good time to germinate, but wait until it rains, because when it rains, the water soluble chemicals that reduce the dissuade germination get washed away. The other thing fire does is it releases nutrients. It's not as big an issue here in Virginia, where we have a relatively moist climate. We get a lot of bacterial and fungal activity that breaks down organic matter. But out west, where you have arid climates, fire is a really important part of the decomposition process. But after fire, you tend to see a release of nutrients. And this is one aspect of particularly the heaths and especially the mountain laurels that's very important to their ecology. In those infertile soils, it can be the process that most of the nutrients are bound up in the organic matter of the plants growing there. And so when we have fire run through those types of stands, those the oak heath stands, the heaths get top killed and then they resprout very vigorously, and the fire actually fertilizes and enhances the nutrient content of the soil. And the reason I pointed specifically to mountain laurel is that what we have seen is in mountain laurel stands where fire has been eliminated for 50 or 60 years, that they actually die off for no particular or identifiable reason. And we think that what's happening is they're simply exhausting the soils and they can't grow there anymore. So the soils won't support them until that organic matter that's bound up in the living part of the plant, until those nutrients are released. And I said few, if any, and I was thinking of the serotinous cones. We don't have any pines that require fire in order to open up and germinate. But as I thought about the mineral soil needs, we actually have a lot of plants that do need the fire to get that mineral soil, although other things like logging operations can reveal that mineral soil and get that kind of germination going. The other adaptation that plants have with fire has to deal with surviving fires that occur. Longleaf pine is probably our very best fire adapted species in Virginia and probably on the East Coast. And that's because it typically grows in what we call pine flatlands or pine savannas. So the picture on the left is a pine flatland down in Florida at the Disney Preserve just south of Orlando. And you can see how widely spread out the trees are. But the reason I took that picture is you can see the older tree in the foreground that has lost a lot of its lower limbs compared to the younger trees in the background. But even when they are young, those long needles, as you can see on the right, that is a longleaf pine seedling that had been through a fire about 2 months before I took that picture. And those long needles, you can see the damage to the tips of the needles from the fire, but they protected that meristem, the primary meristem there that allows that tree to live and continue growing. So these are adaptations that longleaf pine has. Some of our other pines, particularly southern yellow pines, things like loblolly and shortleaf and pond pine, and even table mountain pine, these are trees that will naturally limb up, whereas the eastern white pine won't. And that's because these southern yellow pines grow in areas where we have fire that comes through every 15, 20 years or so. So there are frequent fires that come through. And as we'll talk about in a minute, pines are very flammable. The white pine on the left, which was open grown, comes from a place where we don't have fires that frequently. It's more like 35 to 50 years between. And so that maintains those lower branches. And the difference is that if you have a grass fire that comes through under that white pine, it's going to be able to grab those lower branches and move up into the canopy and potentially kill the tree. Whereas the loblolly pine, and that was not pruned by people, that is the way they grow, grass fire coming through there is not going to be able to jump up into the canopy and kill that tree. Because of that natural limbing up, when I'm talking with schools and they are thinking about doing outdoor classrooms, I frequently recommend loblolly pine as a plant to put out there. Over time, it'll get up and it'll have a high canopy that the students can walk under. And if you've ever walked on pine straw, it's a really nice surface for them to be being out and having their lessons on, as long as they pick up the pine cones. The other adaptation that plants will have is their bark, or to fire is their bark. You may have wondered why it is that different trees, different species have different looking bark, and they to the point where you can, if you're good or if you're trained in it, you can identify trees by their bark. And if you look at the picture on the left, that's loblolly pine, but you can see the plates and the individual tiers of the bark here. And what happens is, as you know, or should know, trees grow from their cambium, which is right below the bark. So every year they put on another ring of wood and get bigger around, and then they put on another ring of bark underneath. So just like the wood of the tree has rings, the bark would have rings too. And as the older bark, which is now dead tissue and can't get any bigger, as it gets spread apart by the growing wood and the growing bark underneath it, it has to crack. And different species have different places that relieve that stress as the bark expands. And that's what causes those different patterns in the bark and allows us to identify trees by their bark. Now, some trees, like the beech on the right, exfoliate very quickly, so they don't keep their bark for very long. Consequently, it is pretty thin and therefore does not provide a lot of thermal insulation to the cambium. And when a fire comes through, even if it's not a big fire, as long as it burns with enough intensity, close enough to the bark for long enough, it can kill that tree because it cooks the cambium tissue right under the bark. A loblolly pine, on the other hand, has that really thick bark that works kind of like an oven mitt and protects that delicate cambium tissue right under the bark. And the white pine in the middle is kind of in between. It can stand a little bit of fire, but if it's too intense or too slow moving, it can be killed by the fire. Hardwoods are also well adapted to fire, or at least some of them, the mid-successional ones. This is my white oak cookie again, and you can see how thick the bark is relative to the total diameter of the cookie. The other thing is that, particularly with the oaks and hickories, they resprout rapidly after the seedlings and saplings will resprout rapidly after a fire top kills the plant. Picture on the right is southern red oak. Again, this is from Piney Grove Preserve. That area, you can see down here, the charred wood and stuff. This area was burned 2 months before that picture was taken. Now, because they're managing this as a savanna for the red cockaded woodpeckers, this tree is always going to be really strange looking because it gets killed every 3 or 4 years in the prescribed burning they're doing down there. But it will bounce back immediately from that. And this is another adaptation to fire. The oaks and the hickories are particularly good at doing this. Those climax species like beech and holly and maple do not do this well, and they're going to have to restart from seed. And that's what gives the oaks and the hickories the opportunity to stay in the landscape in those areas if they have the fire coming through to disturb it. Plants also have to adapt to dry conditions. Now, here in Virginia, we have what is called a moist semi-tropical climate. We get rain pretty much every month. If you look at your local annual or monthly average rainfall, you will probably be surprised at how narrow a band it runs through, between probably somewhere around 2 inches or more in July and August, up to maybe 3 or 4 inches in March and April. I work in the DC metro area, and I've looked at that data for this area, and average monthly rainfall ranges from 2.5 to 4 inches every month of the year. You go out west, particularly in places like Portland or along the Pacific coast, they have what we call a Mediterranean climate. So Portland, which is renowned to be a rainy place, actually has lower average annual rainfall than Washington, D.C. The difference between Portland and D.C. is that most of that rain comes between October and February. When they get to July and August, every year, their July and August is like our July and August of last year, where it's very hot and there is almost no rain. So we have plants that have to adapt to deal with that. And one of their adaptations is to have thick, waxy, flammable cuticles to help prevent water loss. They also evolved to be more efficient at using water, relying particularly on resins and oils to transport defensive chemicals rather than water. And the result is you get a very flammable landscape. Now, this can be important for gardeners, if I remember this correct. Yeah. When you are working with a client who lives in what we call the wildland urban interface, So there is the potential that there could be a wildfire that would come up and threaten the property. You should be familiar with the concept of fire-wise landscaping. And if you look at the evolutionary history of different plants, you'll see why it is that some of them are very flammable, particularly the conifers, which began evolving about the same time that Pangea formed. So it was these plants, the conifers, evolved in continental climates, which tend to be hot and dry at least part of the year. Or, and if you look at the orientation of Pangea, it was down towards the southern pole. So you had more like the tundra and the subarctic conditions throughout lots of it. Consequently, they tend to rely more on these resins and oils, which are very flammable. And if you think about where conifers dominate in North America, up in the boreal northern forests and in the western forests, those are the kinds of conditions where they evolved. Broadleaf trees, on the other hand, are dicots, or angiosperms, and dicots began evolving as Pangea was breaking up. So they had more coastal climates, and they were tended to be in more temperate climates or tropical climates, where they had a lot more water to deal with, and therefore are non-flammable. Flammable, by the way, there's flammable, inflammable, and non-flammable. Flammable means that they're capable of being set on fire. Inflammable means they will ignite even without a fire source. But most of our trees and shrubs in Virginia, except for the conifers and a few of the heaths, the ones that grow in those dry and fertile soils, have very low flammability. So if you are in the wildland urban interface and you're planting a landscape, you definitely don't want to plant your cedars or pines and other conifers up close to the house, because these are the ones that are most likely to create a fire or have a fire situation like you see in the pictures out west, where you get entire 100-foot trees engulfed in flame. Mountain laurel is also quite flammable. When we are out fighting fire or dealing with prescribed fires and mountain laurel is involved, we do not fight fire in mountain laurel. We wait for the fire to come out of the mountain laurel and catch it on the other side when it gets into lower flammability vegetation. The evergreen rhododendrons, those plants that in the trade are called rhododendrons, as opposed to the azaleas, which are rhododendrons, but those evergreen rhododendrons and the blueberries tend to also have a slightly higher flammability. But our deciduous azaleas and most of our other deciduous woody plants, you can plant even in these landscapes close to the house because they do not burn well. You can test this after class. You can go out and hold a flame to a deciduous leaf, and what you will see is it'll just curl up into smoke, and as soon as you pull the flame away, it'll stop. The fire will not propagate in them because they have so much moisture. So with all of this information about how plants are adapted to various parts of our landscape, what does it mean for this landscape here? And in order to understand that, we have to think about what happened to this property as it was going from whatever it was forest before it became this house. What happened here? Well, typically when we develop areas, we remove the topsoil. And of course, the topsoil is the part that is mostly responsible for holding soil moisture, for holding oxygen, and holding the nutrient cations we need in the soil. So we're lowering the fertility of the soil, we're lowering the moisture of the soil, and we're exposing that heavier clay subsoil. This is why most people in urban and suburban settings think we have really crappy soil in Virginia. We don't, It's just that the good part of the soil has been removed before you moved into the urban or suburban area. The other thing we do is after we've removed the topsoil, we compact the lower soil. So if you remember pictures or talking about PEDs, even in Virginia, most of the soils have PEDs that are more or less spherical. Well, when we compact that, if you can imagine taking a ball of Play-Doh and squishing it with your hand, it's going to turn into a broad flat plate. That compacted soil is harder for roots to grow through, and there's less infiltration because we've lost most of the macro pore space in there. It's necessary to do that because otherwise the soil will compact under the building and then your windows and doors won't open and close. The other problem is, of course, that the macropores are where the oxygen is held in the soil, so we have a low oxygen. So just with those things, removing topsoil and compacting soil, we have now created an anoxic, dry, infertile soil. And think back to what we've talked about. Did I mention anoxic, dry, infertile soils at any point in time? And if you think back, you will realize that I talked about dry and fertile soils and I talked about anoxic soils, but they are at different places in the slope. The dry and fertile soils are at the top and the anoxic soils at the bottom. So that makes selecting trees somewhat difficult. If you look at most of our common landscape trees, they tend to be riparian trees, trees from that list that I gave you that started with bald cypress, which suggests that it's harder for trees to overcome anoxic conditions than it is than overcoming the dry and infertile conditions that we usually see. Now, we selected those trees probably not because anybody went through this thought process that we've gone through over the last hour, but because they planted them and they planted a variety of trees, and these are the ones that tended not to die. The other thing that I would, although it's good to keep in mind what these adaptations are and how these trees disperse themselves across the landscape, remember we're talking about competitive advantage. And when you take that tree out of the forest and you plant it in your front yard, it's no longer having to compete with other trees for the resources that it needs. And this is part of the reason these trees can survive in these urban landscapes, but very few of them will thrive because none of them are really adapted to what we do to our soils. I will leave you with this. Good mulching can reduce these stressors over time. And good mulching is mulching as far as you can away from the base of the tree. When people ask me how far they should mulch their trees, I always tell them they should mulch to the property line. It's a whole different lecture about why trees and grass don't get along, but mulch can help rebuild the soil that is damaged or destroyed when we develop areas or develop urban and suburban landscapes. And with that, this is my contact information, and that's all I have to say. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask. I see there is one question already in the Q&A box. So Dave, you want to read the questions and give my voice a rest and let them listen to somebody else for a minute?
I'm happy to do that, Jim, and thank you so much. I was just mentioning to a friend that trees are awesome, so it's a topic that I really enjoy personally. For the first question, this goes back to one of your earliest slides, Jim. I think it was the slide where you had the dry and fertile sites, and you were listing some tree species that would be suitable for that. And this question is focused on where would willow oaks fit into that scale, if at all?
Willow oaks were the next slide or the next list. They are riparian species. That's why they do so well in urban areas. Is I don't think they're really all that phased by the nutrient deficits that they might encounter in urban soils, but they can deal with the anoxic soils and the soil compaction. They are a really good urban species, but they grow down at the bottom of the hill. They're not one of our dryland oaks. They're one of our wetland oaks. And if it's not in the list, it was a gross oversight on my part. Willow oaks and pin oaks both grow in those kinds of areas.
Okay. We have another two more questions. One of them is just general that I'll take. They want to know if this lecture is going to be available online. Yes, all of our concurrent sessions are being recorded, and they will be posted to the Canvas class site, and you will be able to access those very soon after Master Gardener concludes on Sunday. So thank you for that question. The next tree-related question, Jim, that we have for you is starts out with a statement. Maples in our county have a lot of split bark. Should we be concerned? It's happened the last 2 winters.
Depends on where the bark is splitting. And it's not just maples that'll happen. There is something called sun scald or frost cracks. They tend to happen on the southwest side of the tree. And what happens is, if you've ever looked at a tree cookie that has kind of that's split and it's got like a wedge missing from it, what happens is the parenchymal rays are very strong and they prevent the wood from getting reducing their radius. And so as the wood freezes in the winter, it can, as it's trying to shrink, because that's what things do when they get colder, those parenchymal rays can keep it from reducing its diameter, and so it'll split like that. So if it's on the southwest side, I wouldn't worry too much about it. That happens to trees frequently. I've got a lot of pictures of what are called frost ribs. You'll get that kind of stuff. The other thing to keep in mind is that as maple gets older, it does tend to get kind of a shreddy bark. So it, look at the tree, and if it's getting older and that's happening to it, it may just be that the aging process. Otherwise, it could potentially be some kind of a pathogen. It could also be one of the things that causes that is weed whackers that damage the cambium, and they cause a canker that will run up through the tree under the bark, and eventually the bark will split. Whether or not it's an issue, you can look at the wound wood, and if it's growing good wound wood around that split under the bark, then you don't need to worry too much about it. But keep an eye on the canopy above it, because it could be affecting the canopy health.
Okay. Jim, we've had several more questions come in, so we're going to get to as many of these as we can within the last few minutes of our time. And if we don't get to answering the question live with Jim today, we are going to capture the questions and send them to our speakers for them to have a chance to respond at their convenience. So if we don't get to your question today, be patient with us. We will do our best to get you an answer soon. The next question, Jim, this is to give you geographical context, it's coming from Hanover, Virginia. My property has woods that have been untouched and have many small, thin trees, mostly red oaks, maples, pines. Should they be cut out to give more air to others?
It really depends on what your management objectives are. It sounds like this is a forest that is just starting to regenerate. So look at your land use history. I wouldn't be surprised if you found that 25, 30 years ago, it was agricultural land. The The trees will do that themselves. They're all competing for, particularly for space, which means sunlight, in Hanover. And yeah, if you want to take the effort to do what we call crop tree selection, which is you go in and you figure out which trees you want to promote and thinning around them, just like you do in the garden, where, you know, if you've got a vegetable garden and you plant a row of lettuce and you select some of them to come out to give room to the others to grow. That is certainly a reasonable thing to do, and it's something that we sometimes do. In fact, that's what we were doing when we got those 2 tree cookies that I used in the presentation.
All right. Next question, we're shifting back to a soils question, Jim. Can you explain how our suburban soils are dry and anoxic when in clay? I thought clay kept the soil wet.
Well, remember, you do need to get water into the soil in order to keep it moist. And clay is one of those things, like so many other things in nature, a little bit is good, a whole lot is bad. So if you think about modeling clay, it will dry out completely. And it takes a lot. You've got to keep it moist, because if you let it dry out completely, it takes a lot of effort to rehydrate it. So where you have these really heavy clay soils, what will happen is, because we are compacting them, we're crushing out those the macropores. And if you ever thought, you know, I said this several times, partly because it's a pet peeve of mine. I hate it when you read a gardening book or something and it says, this plant will do well in deep, rich, moist, well-drained soils. And I always think, well, what won't? But if you think about the last part of that, moist, well-drained soils, that is something of an oxymoron, because if the soil is well-drained, it shouldn't be moist. And if it's moist, it shouldn't be well-drained. And that aggregate structure that creates the micropores, which hold moisture, and the macropores, which allow water to drain through the soil. When we compact the soil, we're destroying that structure. So all we have are those micropores, but without the macropores to conduct the water, it tends to sheet off. And so that's how, even though you have heavy clay soils, they can be dry, especially if you've got turf growing on top of it, because turf can be almost like an umbrella or a raincoat that will slough off water and not allow it to penetrate much deeper than the root zone. And that's, you know, part of the issue that we run into with trying to grow trees, especially in new developments, is they compact the soil so it's almost like concrete, and then dig a hole in it and put the tree in it, and hopefully they at least remove the burlap from around the tree and expect it to grow. And frequently it never gets out of the planting hole. But you're right, yes, clay in moderation will hold moisture into it, but it will also repel moisture if it's a solid block of clay. And as you get more clay in the soil, it's harder to get water into it.
Very good points, Jim. Thank you. Next question, going back to a tree question. Which trees would be best for a natural area of white oaks that were decimated with the 2018 moisture surge? Just a few left. What should we put in a wet and shady area?
Well, in a wet and shady area, if the white oaks occurred naturally, I would say look at that kind of a forest structure. So white oaks or some of the other oaks. But if it's really shady, the oaks are not going to take. If you've got open spaces where one of the big oaks has died, you could plant another oak there. A lot of that death that occurred last summer was a result of what we call oak decline syndrome. And those trees had been stressed and in decline. And this is one of the things we run into in our developed landscapes, and also at those ridge lines where we don't have such great soils, is the trees are under stress for some reason. And then we have environmental things. So in urban areas, it could be that the tree has exhausted most of the resources that it can get to in the soil, and that stresses it. And then we have a hot, dry summer, and that stresses it more. And then we had these really weird winters where it got really cold very suddenly and then got warm, and that was a stressor on it. And then we had the spring of what was it, 2018, where it rained all year, and we got 50% or more of our annual rainfall that year. And those are all stressors. And so what happened with those oaks, particularly the white oaks and the chestnut oaks out in the forest and in our landscapes, is that was just the last nail in the coffin. Those trees were already in trouble when they hit that patch of really bad weather, and that was it. They couldn't take it anymore. But they'd been dying for 10 years. In fact, they did a study out at the Smithsonian Research Center out at Front Royal, and they found a bunch of the black oaks that died out there. When they did cores, or they cut them down and they looked at the tree rings, they could see that they had been in decline for at least 10 years before they finally died last summer. So I wouldn't worry about that being a bad site for white oaks or for the other oaks that typically grow around them. You can find out more about oak decline syndrome. There's very good publication from the U.S. Forest Service. Just Google or do a search on oak decline syndrome.
All right, thank you. Next question. What about pawpaw?
What about pawpaw? Pawpaw is a plant that I don't worry about. And one of the things I didn't talk about is adaptations to deer. Pawpaw, my pet name for pawpaw is the diesel plant. If you ever crush the leaves of pawpaw, you will know what I'm talking, and smell them. You will know what I'm talking about. You know, spice bush smells really good, but pawpaw smells like diesel fuel, and deer won't eat it. So it's expanding. And that's its competitive advantage, is that the deer won't eat it, but they'll eat all the other things that compete with it. Typically, you find that down in river valleys in the moisture, more anoxic soils, but they are pushing uphill in pretty much every location I have seen where there are pawpaws. But it's a nice plant. It's got good fall color. It doesn't get terribly big. Keep in mind that the pawpaw that I planted in my backyard is now taller than my 2-story house. So they can get relatively big. They are also a colonial plant, so they will spread by suckers underground.
Yeah, it's a great.
One other thing about pawpaw is it is self-sterile. So if you want fruit, you need to source it from 2 different places.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Next question. Are deciduous trees better for carbon footprint than evergreen?
It's hard to make a blanket statement on that. There are a variety of things in terms of ameliorating your own carbon footprint. Deciduous trees on the south and west side of your house are the very best, because what that will do is when they get big and they shade your house, that's going to reduce the amount of energy you spend on air conditioning, therefore the amount of energy that's needed to generate air conditioning in the summer. But because they shed their leaves, it'll allow the sun to warm the house in the winter. So in that aspect, from that aspect of carbon footprint, that would be preferable. But in terms of carbon sequestration, it's kind of a toss-up. Most people think that evergreens, they forget that evergreens also lose their needles. And so part of that carbon cycle is going to be the decomposition of those needles and branches and things that get shed by the evergreens, as well as by the deciduous trees. However, it's really, if you really want to bind carbon in tree biomass, you're better off going with fast growing trees. And that varies depending, among the evergreens as well as among the deciduous trees.
All right. The next one's more of a comment directed to me, but it involves you, Jim. It says, please consider having Jim back to give his talk on why to mulch to the property line. I will put a plug in for Jim. He is going to be back with us tomorrow doing a talk on the benefits of urban forestry. So I'm not sure if he'll get to that topic during that talk, but I would encourage you to come back and listen to him tomorrow.
I won't be talking about mulch, but I will be talking about carbon.
All right. Okay, next question, and we have 2 or 3 more. I think we're okay on time, Jim, as long as you're okay.
I'm okay. This is scheduled to go to 3:30 and my clock says 3:18.
All right, well, we're going to keep going and see if we can get these last 3 questions. Next point, to rebuild your neighbor's yard, for example, what kind of canopy and under canopy and shrubs could you add?
In that case, given what the soils were and what my yard, what's going on in my yard, I would be looking at either an oak heath forest or an acidic oak hickory forest. If you do a search in the Department of Conservation and Recreation's Natural History program does have a list of native plant communities that includes the oak heath and the acidic oak hickory. Oaks would be one thing that I would plant in terms of the trees. Shrubs would be a combination of the heaths as well as viburnums, particularly Viburnum dentatum and Viburnum acerfolia, that's arrowwood and maple leaf viburnum, and blackhaw viburnum would all grow in those soils. In terms of the flowers or the herbaceous stuff, partridge berry, Solomon seal, false Solomon seal, the woodland goldenrods, those all do well in those soils. And then there are some other things that I'd put in there that that grow pretty much anywhere, like the pachyrias, golden ragwort, and the other pachyrias, and Virginia knotweed. Those are all doing really well in my yard, as well as the native deciduous azaleas, the pinksters and the flame azaleas, and those kinds of things.
Well, Jim, we may have to have you do a walk around your yard sometime. It sounds like a pretty nice palette of plants that you've got going on there.
If anybody out there is a master naturalist, I did a program on 5 shrubs from my yard.
Well, you hit some of my favorites. I can tell you that already. Next questions. Natives versus cultivars. Does it make a difference in the resilience in riparian settings?
The resilience of the plant, that's a really hard question to answer because cultivar embraces such a wide variety of things. For example, October Glory red maple is considered a cultivar, but if you read the patent on that plant, it was an open pollinated tree. This nurseryman had this red maple in that he grew in his nursery, and it had this consistent, brilliant fall color. And he patented it, and they made a cultivar out of it by doing cuttings, but it is essentially just a wild red maple. And then I've seen other things called that we would also call cultivars, like coneflowers, that instead of having one layer of rays, they have 2, 3, 4 layers of rays. So it really depends on what they've been doing in terms of the breeding and things. There is going to be variability among plants. I always like to use Ediacaro and what's his name? Shaquille O'Neal. They're both human beings, but they are radically different. Most of you, I assume, know who Shaquille O'Neal is. Eddie Arcaro is a famous jockey from the 70s. So you can imagine what he'd look like standing next to Shaquille O'Neal. So you can breed and select for those things. One plant that I really like is Virginia, or Itea virginiana, which is Virginia sweetspire, but it really won't grow well in my yard. So I wanted to grow it in a large pot on my patio. And I went out and got a cultivar that was called Little Giant. So it was selected to be, smaller than the normal plant. So there are probably cultivars out there that will do better in wet, that handle wet better than the native. The big issue with the cultivars is I really encourage people to stay away from anything that messes with the flower, because there is a tremendously close evolutionary link between flower shape, flower color, flower smell, and the pollinators that use them, the native pollinators. So, if you're looking at something that's really, we're just selecting like this Virginia sweetspire, they weren't selecting for or doing anything to mess with the flowers. They weren't trying to change the color or anything like that. They just were looking for a smaller plant. That's going to have less of an impact on our pollinators than when you buy these weird plants where they have added rows of rays to the flowers. In terms of this question about the riparian or the wetter areas, there may be some cultivars of native plants that are suited there. My advice would be, instead of growing something that's not suitable for a riparian area, find something that is. We have a lot of plants native plants to deal with out there. You don't necessarily need to get into the cultivars.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. Can compost be used as mulch and then shredded wood added on top of it? Is that overkill?
It's funny. I was just talking to, and it was today, I was talking to this couple about this plant that I couldn't identify. And the husband pointed at the wife and said, she's the plant person. I just do the work. And I responded, yeah, I know what it was like. My mom was a gardener and I was the long-handled shovel. So that's kind of colored my view of gardening. And compost is great, but I'm a forester, and this is one of my perspectives to from a forester is nature is composting all the time. That's what the forest floor is. And if you dig through it, you go from the leaf litter and you get into the duff, which is all compost. It's not necessarily overkill, but it's certainly more work than you need to do. Part of the point of putting down the shredded mulch, and I would encourage everybody to stay away from bark. Bark is designed to repel water, so it's not going to provide a lot of that water, that water benefit that you want, and it'll float away in a rainstorm. Go with the wood mulch, particularly the hardwood mulch if you can get it. Actually, the very best mulch is arborist chips, the stuff that comes right off the truck. I know there's some people think that creates a nitrogen draft, but there is absolutely no science that supports that. So my feeling is just put down the mulch and let it decompose and compost in place, because that's what composting is. It's just decomposing organic matter. If you think you're not getting enough nutrients, and that's one of the advantages of the arborist chips, especially if you get it during the growing season, is they're going to have some leaf and some bark and stuff in there that'll decompose and give you nitrogen and phosphorus. But there's no reason you can't put down compost and mulch. It just, making compost is a lot of work to me.
Or expensive if you're having to truck it in.
Yep.
All right. Last question that we have at the moment. Do you have any comments on fringe trees?
Fringe tree. Fringe tree is a great tree. If you can grow it in your yard, I strongly recommend it. It has a wonderful aroma. It's got one of the best flower scents I have ever encountered. I've tried to grow it in my yard and it doesn't work. Fringe tree naturally occurs down in riparian areas. It's a small understory tree, and it may be one that obviously it's going to be able to deal with the compacted soils, but it may be one that needs a little more moisture than and a little more fertility than what I have in my yard. My yard, as I said, is more of an oak heath. It's one of those dry and fertile sites, so it didn't do well here. But yeah, I forgot about that one. It would go in that list with that started with the bald cypress and included the willow oaks and those things. In terms of if you're, the question was spurred because of emerald ash borer. At this point, what we have seen is the emerald ash borer only infected some really, really stressed fringe trees. But we have not seen, it's never been demonstrated that it can complete its life cycle or that it would be particularly fatal to fringe trees. So I highly recommend it if it'll grow in the property.
All right, excellent. Again, another one of my favorites that I fell in love with when I spent 10 years in the Midwest. It's a wonderful tree.
Yeah. I fell in love with it the first time I smelled it, the flowers.
All right. Well, we have probably less than a minute. A couple more questions have popped up real quick, Jim, if you have time. How about smoke trees? Where are they best suited? And this will be the last question.
Smoke trees are probably best suited if you are in Western Virginia. That's where they're native to. I don't know a lot about their horticulture. Like I said, I've been working mostly in Fairfax and been mostly here. My understanding is their native area would be the mountains in the west. Take the information I gave you, thinking about where they're growing on slopes and things, and look at that, and that can give you some information about where it might do well. I know that some of the people, one of my predecessors actually started out as a horticulturist rather than a forester, and she really liked smoke trees. So I assume they will do well in an urban setting, but I'm not that familiar with the plant.
All right. Well, fantastic. We are up on our time. Jim, let me publicly say thank you for spending an hour and a half with us today with a great presentation. And to our audience, this is being recorded, and we will share with you as soon as we can.
Okay. Bye-bye.